if we're not willing to take responsibility for understanding what are the things that we really want, and not just want as in, wanting a sugar buzz or a caffeine fix or a, sexual rush or whatever, but really wanting in terms of finding meaning and understanding what has meaning for us. If we're not willing to take the responsibility to find that, then we risk being given a horrible selection of alternatives.
This is Truth Sings. I'm here with Timothy Mitchell. Thanks so much for coming on the show. I'm excited to talk to you. Tim's a good friend of mine in this town of Paonia where we live. And Tim, you've been working on a book, and you're actually on book 3. You finished book 3. You're going back through an editing process right now. And I thought it'd be a great chance to just kind of talk to you about your writing process, some of your inspiration. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to speak a little bit about the book and the process and mythology and any of the other things we talked about over the last couple of years.
One of the aspects I wanted to talk about is you draw inspiration from Greek mythology, and so this is a story set in modern times, but it's kind of rooted in the question, what if the Greek myths were real, and what would be the continuation of those stories? What are some of the hanging questions from the original Greek mythology, and just continuing to explore that. So I thought that was really interesting and carried something of importance to me, and I think would be interesting to other people as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about what actually brought that forward for you? What inspired you to make that connection?
Yeah. I guess the first starting point for me was that, I had an idea, during my senior year at St. John's, where we read a lot of Greek stuff and we, read a lot of math and science. And I imagined what it would be like to see a subatomic particle flying, like in some of Einstein's thought experiments. And originally I was writing a story like that. And then the character, the Greek god, the messenger god Hermes, popped up in my story. And, and I thought, that's an interesting intrusion into this story about, modern physics. And, I started really thinking more and more about that. It just kept opening up, and I'd read a little more about mythology, read a few more stories, read a little more deeply into this or that story. And the character Prometheus really jumped out to me as one of the most complicated, really, of all the figures in mythology, his role. And for the sake of the listeners and viewers, I'll give just a little bit of background on Prometheus, if that's good for you. Prometheus isn't actually technically a god. The gods are the Olympians. So that's Zeus and Hera and, most of their offspring. So Apollo, Artemis, Athena, Hermes, Hephaestus, Persephone, Demeter. I mean, there are quite a few. I won't name every single one of them. Ares, anyway. But Prometheus was actually technically a Titan. So that would have been the generation that spawned the gods. So that would be Zeus's father, Kronos, and Zeus's mother, Rhea. And their siblings and other offspring. So Prometheus was the son of another Titan named Themis. But Prometheus's role, so that's enough context, I think, for the moment. But Prometheus's role, his name actually translates to know before, foreknowledge. And so he was, much like his mother Themis, he was one of the figures that was able to see the future. And so he was able to give prophecies. And Themis similarly gave prophecies. She actually foretold the overthrow of Kronos at his son Zeus's hands. and Prometheus similarly had a certain foresight. So Prometheus's role as sort of counselor to the gods, their oracle, if you will, who enabled them to see where the Titans would be, and then enabled them to defeat the Titans ultimately in battle and take over control of the universe, if you follow the story sort of in that linear direction. That puts Prometheus in one light, but then we see him at his most prominent point in our histories and our writings as a figure who was being tortured by Zeus. Well, that's a little confusing. How did he go from being trusted advisor and maybe the reason why the gods overthrew the Titans to all of a sudden being punished? And the way he was punished was designed to be as excruciating as possible. As an immortal, as someone whose body would grow back, the torture for him was very painstakingly thought out, such that he was chained to a rock, and an eagle flew down and ate his liver out of his body every single day, causing him immeasurable pain. And then his body overnight would heal itself, and then he'd undergo the same torture all over again. I mean, this is a very visceral and very graphic punishment. So again, questions, sort of came up for me and lingered. Why was Zeus so upset at this guy who had given him, his power, his seat of power, his ability to overthrow his father and right the wrongs of the universe, or so the story goes. I think there are lots of really meaningful questions in mythology.
Well, wait, was it Themis who prophesied Zeus overthrowing his father?
Mm-hmm. And
what role did Prometheus have in that?
Well, Prometheus believed that the Titans were unjust, and in the same way that we can look at power dynamics, if, say, we look at ancient Rome or something, the powers that are in place, when the empire has been in place for a long time, then it's doing, unjust actions. A lot of people would say similar things about, say, the United States today, for instance, that we've been in power for too long and we're doing unjust things, and we similarly should maybe be overthrown for the sake of our unjust actions.
Or certainly there's a lot of things that you can criticize.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
And Prometheus being someone who can see the timeline, the entire timeline unfolding,
Mm-hmm.
He's going to have a perspective, a more complete perspective, and probably valid criticism.
Yeah. And I think that's some of the the fodder for the story, so to speak, as far as what would it look like if we actually, if anyone had oracular sight. What would that look like? What would the consequences for that person be? What would the consequences for those around them be? One of the beauties of the way our consciousness is set up now, so to speak, is that we often, don't know what's going to happen, in the not too distant future. Maybe some of us would yearn to at some point, but oftentimes having the experience allows for the lesson. And so, if someone, this is particularly relevant right now, say culturally, over the last 6 months, where the movie Dune, Part 2, Denis Villeneuve's interpretation of Frank Herbert's classic, has captured the minds, of people again. And it's a question of that character, Paul, being able to see all possible futures and seeing possible realities, possible horrors, both done without him being involved, but also some horrors being done in his name with his involvement. And then having to struggle with that. Is he okay with that? What is he willing to take responsibility for? Which one of those possibilities does he feel good about or bad about? So similarly, these are some of the things that one would imagine would be going on inside of Prometheus.
Yeah, and you can imagine none of that conversation would be happening if you didn't have somebody with a moral and ethical foundation to actually, want to do right by the people around him, by the civilization. If you combine if you combine power with a person who's just out for personal gain, you get more like the Harkonnen sort of element in the story.
Yeah.
I read the Dune series when I was in grade school. I guess I started reading those, and definitely shaped some of my thinking and inspired me early on in life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the Dune series, has an interesting tie-in. The House Atreides supposedly found its roots going back all the way to ancient Greece, which is the House of Atreus, which is a storied house, the house of Agamemnon and Menelaus. During the Iliad, we see them front and center. But the story of their house is actually a terrible one as well, as far as this was a story of one brother feeding his brother's children to him in a meal. These are challenging. Some of these are really challenging stories where they go to the heart of the matter. They go to the raw and the visceral. And
am I correct in saying like these are like they're core elements of human nature that are being discussed here, and they're being brought out through the example of story. But they're being brought forward for people to consider that morally, ethically, in their own life, should they come upon a similar crossroads.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's some of the work that Joseph Campbell did, and certainly a lot of folks have touched upon his work, or if you haven't, I'd strongly encourage you to, give Joseph Campbell a look. He looks at all mythologies and finds commonalities through them, that, to your point, these are speaking to things that we all have experience of, that there's this overlapping map. You could even, another way of simply thinking about it, I guess, is something like Jung's collective unconsciousness idea, that we all have this shared fabric of consciousness, and we all have the ability to directly experience any of these things. In particular, in my series, Particles, I think a lot in terms of essences. So I think of each of the gods as representing more of a body having coalesced and being in complete and total alignment with an essence. So, for instance, for me, the figure Athena, whose primary qualities, as stated over and over again. In other words, what do we call her? The goddess of what? We call her the goddess of justice. That's one thing we call her. We also call her the goddess of wisdom in battle. So this is another type of, and they're actually quite similar. If one steps back and thinks about, well, what does justice have in common with wisdom in battle? Well, the component elements of justice, right, are evaluating an entire circumstance and then having the ability to then direct the force of the state or the force of a body that's been empowered into the one who's the distributor of justice. Well, in the same way, the army has entrusted that ability into the person with the wisdom in battle, the general, if you will. And then the general studies the field, and the general directs the force. The judge studies the case, the judge directs the force. So there's a similarity there that to me speaks to an essence, which is an essence of wisdom and temperance and really carefully considering a matter. And it's somebody who carefully considers a matter that inspires trust in us. So we trust a judge. We trust a general in their role.
Right.
Something like that.
Yeah, and there's sort of an ideal archetype represented here that as people contemplate, here's how Athena would treat this battle situation, there's some way in which that inspires admiration or wanting to wanting to embody some of those qualities yourself.
Yeah, no, I think that's the case in Campbell's work. I think he, tried to, in some of his writings, which I'm not intimately familiar with, I'm just sort of generally familiar with his work, that he brings forward a lot of examples that, for instance, I'm not sure if he coined the term hero's journey, but certainly it's something that a lot of people think of Campbell in conjunction with, that there's a certain type of a story progression of the hero's journey. There's a certain type of a story progression of one finding inner strength. There's a certain, there are all types of story templates, if you will, that we find within the world mythologies that are speaking to these sort of general but also immediately experienceable phenomena that we can encounter in life.
So why is it important that we should be resurfacing these kinds of things from Greek mythology?
I think there are a lot of reasons. In this day and age, one of the major reasons for me is there's a professor at the University of Toronto, Vervanke, who speaks about meaning a lot, and he declares that we're having a meaning crisis right now, that there's a real absence of meaning in the world, and it's actually causing significant problems. I think this is one piece of what's going on right now and why we need a resurfacing. I think.
Well, Viktor Frankl was talking about this in the 80s.
Oh, right? Yeah.
When he wrote Man's Search for Meaning,
yep,
and developed the whole practice of logotherapy around really rekindling that source of meaning in people's lives, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and in fact, the word when you mentioned logo, I mean this is direct from a Greek word logos, which is a meaning or an understanding of a thing, and so we also have that in our language translated more simply as word. For instance, logos is the word that's translated at the beginning of the Gospels. In the beginning was the Word. Well, the word that's there in ancient Greek is logos, and that's what we translate as word. But what word or meaning in this particular case means is a thorough understanding of what's going on. So not simply having had an experience, but actually having reflected upon the experience, understanding the component parts of the experience, understanding the root cause of the experience, understanding the outcome as a result of the experience, what goes out into the world from there. So it's really understanding something very thorough and comprehensive is what the Greeks would have meant by an understanding or a meaning of something.
Like to understand the true nature of it.
Yeah. Yeah, really fully and completely. And some might say the only way you can do that is to have lived it, right? To have let the experience fully permeate oneself is maybe the only way at arriving at a true understanding of an experience. So
talk more about that. How does that enter into the book series that you're writing?
Yeah, so at least for me, the book series, there are certainly going to be similar story arcs. I am not trying to unbearably break any molds, but what is important for me is that the characters are really whole and complete, and are really experiencing a fullness of interaction and a fullness of being present within themselves. I think that characters too often are pushed aside for pace of plot or keeping the formula of the 80,000 word novel, which is the suggested length of most novels these days. The character is generally the thing that suffered the most, and I think, at least for me growing up, when I was reading a book, it would really be the character that I would have to care about in order to want to continue reading the book.
Sure.
And too often, for me personally, I find myself not reading a lot of contemporary books anymore, or at least not a lot of contemporary fiction, because I find a lack of connection with the subject matter. Not that the plot can't be fascinating or that there couldn't be some unforeseen twist that maybe gave me a cheap thrill, but I'm really not in reading for cheap thrills anymore at this point. I'm in reading for actually finding a being that's in a challenging situation, and I actually care about what's happening to the being. And I want to see how they handle a complicated situation with nuance. I want to see how someone, finds a moment of patience, how someone finds something like that essence of Athena that I mentioned before, how someone can connect with that and not have a knee-jerk reaction to something, but they can step back from themselves and say, okay, I really want to behave well in this situation. I don't want to misbehave. I want to respect the decision that I make later. And so I really want to gather all the information here. I really want to get down to the root of something and make a responsible choice. That feels more interesting to me than, this Marvel character did this Marvel character did that.
Does it feel like we have a lack of examples of, is our moral framework eroding in our society today?
Yeah. I think it's pretty easy to say that, but I also think it's also a question of why. And unfortunately, when I, pick up such questions, I find pretty unsatisfying answers from a lot of the people who would presuppose, that they just know the quick and simple answer. At one point in the 80s, it was rap music was the demon in the room. Right now, it's social media and it's video games are the demons in the room, or breaking the moral fiber. I think the problems are more nuanced, and I think going into them, requires, more patience and more forethought. I do feel like we have a lack of examples, and as to respond more directly to your question, I try and write, my characters in such a way that we actually see, for instance, a healthy couple within my story, or at least that's my aspiration, from a lot of interpersonal development work I've done, a lot of the reading and study and things like that. I feel like I've seen plenty of characters on screen exhibiting bad behavior. I don't think we have a shortage of those examples. I do think we have a shortage of noble characters acting in very respectable and worthwhile, praiseworthy ways. Mm. And so for me personally, my heart calls out to see more examples like that. I want to be touched that way in my heart. I want to be touched by two characters that love each other with a deep, abiding respect and admiration, and have a deep trust and desire to see one another do well, and not two people that lust for one another in one moment and then go and misbehave in the rest of their lives, and then come home and spread a balm on the other person to help them get over their misbehaviors, and then misbehave towards the other. Again, these are the negative examples. We've got plenty of those. I want to see more of the other. I want to see more of, Taoism is something that is not, Brandon and I speak about this often, but for the sake of the listeners, it's not something that a lot of people alive today, in the West at least, have a lot of clarity on. Mm. And this is a space where you often hear men, villainizing women, women villainizing men, especially in this day and age, and, or villainizing more correctly, you often hear the term toxic masculinity. Well, there's nothing toxic about masculinity. Masculinity is a flow of energy in the universe. Now, do certain men misbehave when they're behaving with a masculine flow? Absolutely. Do certain women misbehave when they're flowing with this masculine flow? Absolutely. Does that mean that masculinity itself is toxic? Absolutely not. That's not how these things work. They're energy flows. Much like saying a hammer is wrong because it was used in a murder. I mean, that's a very simplistic analogy, but you follow my meaning. So to get back to your question more succinctly, I think we need more positive examples. We need more role models of a kind. I think they need to present in a different light. And I think one way to do that is actually by plumbing not the sacred cow examples per se. I'm not interested in relitigating, all the parables from the Bible. I don't find them particularly illuminating. But I think that mythology is a space which, in its very form, it has within it an accessibility for any age, for any time. It truly has a timelessness, and someone can easily understand the stories within mythology. And so that's essentially what I'm attempting to draw from, is the mythologies as source, but then providing stories where we can see the qualities of mythology present, in a story that's being told in a contemporary setting.
Yeah. One of my mentors told me once, there is no new wisdom. Mm-hmm. And he was trying to communicate, the distinction between this focus we have on running and accomplishing and adopting the newest technologies, the latest, greatest thing, and that wisdom pertains to human nature. It pertains to biology. It pertains to the state of our existence. And that hasn't actually changed that much over the course of the years. And so there's a lot that's incredibly valuable there, within all of these cultures that have developed all around the world. They have these gems of wisdom mm-hmm. that they've collected, that they've said, over the past 1,000 years, these are the gems that have risen to the surface that we want to share. Mm-hmm. And I find something just very beautiful and worth appreciating in that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I would mention just quickly in passing, not to detract from the direction that we started on, but there's someone here in our town locally who's very taken by the wisdom of one of the African tribes, speaking a great deal about grief and different grief rituals. And that tribe actually sent a couple of their youngest and brightest to the West to try and share that wisdom. And their feeling is that, we don't handle grief very well in the West, and it's actually killing us. And potentially because the West is the seat of most of the kinetic power on the planet, it's potentially killing the planet because we have some sort of a fundamental breakdown going on right now in how we handle grief. So that would be one particular anecdote I would put alongside the example that you brought up.
And I know that's coming from the tradition of Patrice Maladroma. I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, but yeah. he wrote a book called The Healing Wisdom of Africa. Mm-hmm. And
Martine Prechtel is the other one that I hear a lot in the same school.
I've read that book, and man, it has a lot that really sat with me as insightful. We don't realize like what we're giving up when we're raised in a certain culture. We don't realize all of the other cultures that are possible over tens of thousands of years of human history. We don't have that side-by-side comparison. We come into the world new. Mm-hmm. And so I think it is really insightful to look at the perspectives of people who have come from different cultures and to walk forward intentionally mm-hmm. to say, well, what is it that we are looking to create now?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's right. And at least for me, another, you asked about the mythology, but I mentioned to you before we started today that another place where I draw a lot of wisdom that informs my writings is just from my past study of the ancient Greek language. There are so many layers to many of the words. There's there are two words that ancient Greeks sometimes, that English speakers would translate them as time, and only one of them is probably properly translated purely as time, and that's chronos, which would be our notion of chronological time. The other one is a Greek word called kairos, and we don't really have a one-word easy translation for that. It would be something like at the correct moment. So kairos could be thought of as the moment when the archer releases the arrow when he means to strike a moving target, or when a musician plays the right note, which is in the right time signature at the right instant to maintain the melody and the harmony. Mm-hmm. These would be examples. Or it used to be used a lot in the context of rhetoric, that to be trained in public speaking would be to feel the flow of the group that you're speaking to, and to understand the moment when the argument or the conversation needed to be shifted at just the right instant. And so having the ear or the ability to attend to that moment and shift the entire process of the discussion, that would be another example of kairos. But there's so much wisdom in thinking about that. I mean, I place kairos, as a primary concept in my third book. When my character, the goddess Athena, sort of arrives in her full majesty, so to speak. But that is to say, the essence of wisdom in battle, and the essence of justice sort of makes an appearance in the story and really starts manifesting. One of the ways in which it expresses itself is through kairos, meaning the wisdom of the judge, knowing when the right moment of receiving the testimony from the plaintiff and the testimony from the defendant, when the right moment is to let the jury deliberate, when the right moment is to execute the sentence. All of these are component pieces, and a deep understanding of kairos is present in these things. So that's just an example of how both the language and the examples from mythology and a deeper study and meditation upon mythology has sort of informed my writings.
What do you think that people today can take away from reading, say, the embodiments of these essences?
Yeah, I think, as I try to wade into my story, I try to bring, a couple of younger characters who are as true as I can make them to a couple of 20-year-olds today, finding themselves, at the phase that most 20-year-olds are at, which is trying to figure out, where's my place in the world? What's my career? What do I want to do with my life? What good do I want to do in the world? How do I want to proceed in, any of the myriad of ways that 20-year-olds can think? And they discover this, this world of mythology that's been sewn into the normal world today. And upon doing that, what I find to be compelling is seeing someone with what is somewhat a conventional mentality encountering other beings that are informed and motivated in sort of deeper and older ways. That for me, I don't very often find a lot of people in the world today being motivated by many deeper or older ways. Most people that I encounter are feverishly trying to travel or accumulate more finances or material things, or chasing experiences of an ephemeral nature, and not doing a lot of meaningful, penetrative work. And
in terms of penetrating into your own consciousness and exploring what's there.
Yeah. That professor that I mentioned earlier, Vervanke, he uses this expression in a lot of his podcasts in conjunction with the sort of psychedelic revolution. Some people are calling it a revolution. I don't know. It's a pretty early adopter phase, I think. But, these people that are encountering a psychedelic experience and craving, finding that they're willing to go into these radical experiences of taking ayahuasca or taking psilocybin or taking any of these things. He says that the similarity that's present in us all is a desire to encounter the really real. He uses that phrase. And I think that that this desire is born from the plasticity of so many of the other younger behaviors that most of us have that's really sort of inundates our culture in the West, chasing after these ephemeral things all the time, trying to pile up the rewards from whichever activities we're doing, all of that sort of behavior pattern. It's away from something which I think is intrinsic for most of us, which is the wisdom you were asking me about earlier. I think most of us have some inkling of a moral framework, some inkling of what's the right thing to do here, some inkling of how could I behave in order to be praiseworthy. Now, I want to be careful about a statement like praiseworthy or a term like praiseworthy. I don't mean necessarily praiseworthy by other people. I don't mean that we have to, only find our esteem in other people, but praiseworthy for ourselves, feeling good about our own actions.
Doing something that you're proud of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But more than just, for me, the word pride, at least the way that I hear it used a lot, would be a little bit more egocentric in terms of, well, if I feel proud, then my ego sort of balloons a little bit. But I mean to have maybe something more like a pride which has a quality of contentment within it, and not contentment within the sense of, it's Saturday afternoon and I finished my chores and boy, don't I feel content for a moment, or I'm sitting in this warm tub and it's good enough or something. But really, I've been happy with the way that I live my life this week. I've been happy with the way that I'm forming my life this month, this year. I'm feeling good about the relationships that I have. I'm feeling good about the way that I'm connecting with other people. I'm feeling good about the way that other people are connecting with me. I'm seeing a positive feedback. I'm seeing a good trend emerge from the way that I'm living my life. Something more like that, more nuanced and with deeper roots, rather than, well, I just went to a yoga class and I got a killer buzz from all my endorphins went flying around my body and now I'm feeling awesome and I'm going to reward myself for my workout by going and getting a Frappuccino at Starbucks. And then, good on me. I feel content. I did a good thing this afternoon. Yeah, I think there are key differences in that. And the language doesn't always mark it.
I think we have some big questions to ask as a society. And I think this is kind of the elephant in the room and in general right now. People may disagree in terms of what's going wrong. They may disagree in terms of who's responsible. They may disagree in terms of what the solutions are. Mm-hmm. But there's a general sense right now that something's wrong. Maybe a whole constellation of things are wrong. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways, we're going to need to come to terms with this. We're going to need to redefine ourselves as, well, how do we want society to function? What do we want our lives to look like? And, I feel it's very important that people actually engage with those questions on an individual level, because I think if we don't, an answer is going to be presented to us. It's going to come through governance. It's going to come through large, powerful corporations and NGOs, and it may not be the answers that you want. It may not be the answers that actually align with your own personal values. Mm-hmm. So, what are your personal values? What would virtue look like? What would strength look like? Mm-hmm. What does a properly functioning society look like?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing at something that I would phrase as, if we're not willing to take responsibility for understanding what are the things that we really want, and not just want as in, wanting a sugar buzz or a caffeine fix or a, sexual rush or whatever, but really wanting in terms of finding meaning and understanding what has meaning for us. If we're not willing to take the responsibility to find that, then we risk being given a horrible selection of alternatives. And this is the way authoritarianism creeps in. This is the way corporatism and oligarchy and all sorts of other...
This is like what's happening politically in the country right now. Yeah. In my view, we have, shitty options that are being pushed in front of us, and then we're being told, like, well, these are the only options, and if you don't vote for one of these, you're wasting your vote. Mm-hmm. To me, it really speaks to a breakdown in the overall integrity of the system. Mm-hmm. And, the original, the Declaration of Independence and the foundation of the country was based on this no taxation without representation. So, we're living in a country that was birthed from that impulse to actually create a representative government. Mm-hmm. And I think over time, what has happened is interests have developed in their level of influence in the system, and we're now back to that stage where the people aren't represented. And so how do we come back to a place where that alignment and that representation can take place again? That feels like an open question in our society right now.
Yeah, well, it's certainly a question begging an answer, when it comes to, that space in particular. I mean, and I think it's challenging to have any conversations because of the fractured nature of the just of the methods of communication in general, but also the ways that we're speaking, the platforms that we're speaking upon, the ways that we engage in communication. All of those things are not helping. Poor educations in terms of understanding our own cognitive biases, understanding our own logical fallacies. I mean, we don't do any training in this country about any of those things. It's certainly not en masse, only in pockets.
I some of my intro classes in college were actually on cognitive bias, and something I appreciated is that we were exposed to that. I think if you're going into business negotiations, let's say, mm-hmm. Or if you're, managing the press for a company, let's say. Mm-hmm. You want to have good press, not bad press. Almost everything we do in life comes down to orienting ourselves around the people around us, the institutions, and so without an understanding of rationality versus cognitive biases, mm-hmm. I mean, you're really not equipped to deal with when somebody comes at you with something that's irrational and just designed to throw you under the bus.
Yeah, ad hominem attacks.
Yeah.
How does one gracefully handle those? How does one ask someone else to desist in...
Or to justify their position.
Yeah.
Like, I'd like you to iterate, how you justify this position.
Yeah. Yeah, or also to make clear what the boundaries on a conversation might be. That, if the scope of a conversation is a certain thing, bringing in ad hominem material is simply not appropriate, in a lot of conversational structures. Those conversations can happen elsewhere. Someone's character can be litigated elsewhere. But when the conversation is to be about a specific topic, then the conversation should really stay on that topic unless there's something, very powerfully pertinent, about the other quality that's being questioned. Whether someone is truly qualified to speak on that matter or, I don't know. I think a lot of work has to be done on in the space of communication skills, communication formatting, the backdrop. Your point about taxation without representation. One of my favorite points that I go back to when I think about that is, Washington at the Constitutional Convention, where, he literally brought it to a halt when someone proposed, I've forgotten the exact numbers now, where one of the group was pushing towards 40,000 constituents per representative. And Washington was adamant that it could not be more than 30. This was something that, ground the entire convention to a halt once upon a time, and Washington ended up getting his way so that they could move forward. And yet here we are today with something like, I think the average is 7.5 million, I think, per district are the rough numbers right now. It's something like that. And we were supposed to have expanded the Congress.
Feels like it can't be that high. Like 700,000, maybe. I don't know. I haven't looked at the numbers, but
I've forgotten the scale. So
Phoenix itself.
Error.
Phoenix was a city of like 7 million people.
How many representatives
when I lived there?
Phoenix alone.
But then you got all the rural districts in the state as well. So I think the average couldn't be that high. But I don't know.
No, I'm sure you're right.
But it's certainly a lot higher than 30,000.
I think it's 750,000. I think that's what it is. Anyway.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot higher now than 30,000.
Yeah.
And, going back to the original intentions and the reason that limit was so important to maintain, it's like, well, there's a Dunbarian limit, right? There's, you can only reasonably know about 32 people closely. And then you have maybe a circle of associates, more casual relationships.
Up to like 150.
Yeah. But at 30,000, we start to reach limits of can one person represent the viewpoints of this many people?
Yeah.
And it starts to be very questionable. Like, and then the end result today is like, well, no. Like, actually, a lot of people aren't being represented.
Yeah, that's my question when I look at a number that big. So say it's 750,000, which sounds more right as I think about it. It's a huge number regardless. It's certainly impossible, and this is, for me, the underlying quality that's important. It's certainly impossible for me to realistically expect that I could have a conversation with my congressperson. Absolutely unthinkable, with 750,000 people, that I'm one of that group, and knowing that our system is skewed towards the largest financial donors, and they're going to have a disproportionate amount of time. So, say you divided up the number of seconds in a year or something like that, and so each constituent gets a certain number of seconds that they can speak to their representative. There's no way that I can express my concerns, my needs, whatever, to be fairly represented. So to go back to the earlier point that you were making about, why was America, founded, no taxation without representation. Well, we are absolutely being taxed to the gills, and we have no hope of being represented as an individual.
And not only are we being taxed, the money is being printed, which is another way in which value is slipping out of our pockets that we have no control over.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all true.
But to draw this back, in terms of, taking inspiration from the Greek classics, in terms of taking inspiration from these archetypal stories, there's two levels at which we can do that. First, at the individual level, how can my life be an embodiment of these principles that I value? Mm-hmm. And then also at the societal level, as participants within a society, we each have our own voice in being a part of the collective, determining who are we, right?
Yeah. I mean, as I say, for me, the Greek frame, the mythology as well as the language, continue for me to be a constant source of framing a container for, a compelling story. And to me, they feel very potent and very powerful in doing that. I'd mention briefly, when I went to my college, which is an unusual little college in Santa Fe called St. John's, and there's a sister campus in Annapolis, for those listening. And they call themselves a great books college on 2 campuses. And one of the first questions that we take up is, what is a great book? What is a great book? What makes a book great? It's a good question. One of the answers appears to be that the content that's within the book has a perpetual relevance. It keeps coming up. It doesn't get dated. Some of these things that are in Plato's dialogues or in Greek, theater, those don't get dated. Homer doesn't get dated. You could pick up a copy of the Iliad today, and you could find a dozen things that would interest you. The same thing with the Odyssey. You could pick up a dozen things that interest you if you picked up a copy of the book today.
And maybe inspire things that are going on in your life right now. Inspire new solutions, new ways of approaching the situation.
Yeah. And so by orienting around this question of essences and what does that mean, and some of my characters are associated with some of the Greek deities. They are part of, and I borrow a Greek word for it, theasis, which is something like an entourage or a following, a group of followers, a group of similar-minded people. I think a lot as I'm writing about, is there an independent existence of something like essence, or does it have to be embodied? And for me, this is something like thinking about quantum physics and the question of, are there actually particles? This is a very powerful question that a lot of physicists are thinking about all the time. Or are they just discrete regions of space? Similarly, I think a lot about, are there essences, or must an essence be represented by an individual? And so, at least for me, that's, one of my origin source points. I asked the question when Hermes first popped up in one of my stories, what does it mean to be a messenger? What does it mean to deliver a message? I mean, it's a worthwhile question that opens up opportunities for, a meditation of some hours or days, or something that resurfaces over and over again. I've already mentioned Athena, but, I also think about the question of, what is Hephaestus? What is the god of blacksmithing and technology? What does that look like? What would that look like today? And one of the places I go to with it is, I think they'd probably be the Hephaestian theasis, the followers of the essence of technology would probably be focused on computers and coding and hacking in this day and age, and not so much making pulleys or making levers, which is the way they would have maybe been portrayed, in ancient Greek times.
So the
weapons.
Hephaestus, or the Hephaestian essence is more technology broadly than it has to do with fire or blacksmithing.
Yeah. Yeah, to me, at least in that day and age, blacksmithing was one of the cutting edge technologies. The ability to craft, ore into metals, sound out the metals, to understand the process of tempering and forging. I mean, this was a real development around that era of time. And then creating simple tools and simple machines. These were real developments around that phase of time. And they allowed life to be easier to a point. They allowed tasks to become simpler. And so it's a consideration of that, if that's a core fundamental aspect of technology, which, it just so happens that the root of the word technology also comes to us from Greek, techne, which is a repeatable art or craft. And so that, again, provides an opening. So I don't mean to go into any one of these, overly extensively, but just the idea is that these essences provide such an interesting framework as an opening for us to look at various subject matters and understand how do all of these things come together. And then, of course, one of the questions that I bring up in my second book is about what is leadership? What does the leadership of essences look like? And at least for me, it's a question of how should essences be oriented to one another? How should they be oriented to us in general? And I think that's in part what speaks to some of your questions, that some of the things you've been bringing up is, it's my feeling that the essences are sort of out of alignment right now in this day and age. We could say, well, justice doesn't seem to be working the way that justice should be working. Commerce doesn't really seem to be working the way that commerce should probably be working. Technology is probably not working the way technology should be working. War is not really working, so we could really go down the checklist and say, wow, okay, it seems like almost every essence is it's almost like the machine is thrown a spoke, thrown a spar. The wheel is, spinning around wildly, and it's throwing off things in directions that they shouldn't be thrown off in. This is the system breaking down. This is what it looks like. Essences are akimbo.
Yeah, and you have a language through the essences of describing what a well-functioning system working together would look like, and also of describing where the breakdowns are occurring and what the nature of that is that can you think of an example maybe of present day situation that you can describe as a misalignment of essences?
Sure. I mean, I think the world is pregnant with them. I mean, I think just on the world stage, there are, there are a couple of key conflicts that are drawing a lot of attention right now. That are very complicated and very nuanced, and there are a lot of powers and narratives floating around on all of them. But underneath all of them, there is raw human experience that is experiencing a lot of warfare right now, and an inability of its leaders to have to reach diplomatic agreements. A lot of trust that's been broken. Whether you want to think about Ukraine and a lot of the pieces that went into the war that's happening currently in Ukraine, or occupation, some would call it, or invasion, others would call it, or, there are lots of words that could be thrown around for that. Similarly, you've got another war happening within the Gaza Strip. This is another era where there's a lack of alignment. There's a lot of the world that would like to see a ceasefire being called there. There's a lot of death that's happened. Without intention, a lot of accidental death. And one side, at least in that conflict, doesn't seem to particularly care about an amount of suffering that they're causing. This is an incident where if you could imagine something like, active gods, if you pictured, let's go back and think about in the Iliad, one of the recurring images in the Iliad that's conjured by Homer is Zeus sitting up on high on top of Olympus watching the battle before the gates of Troy unfolding. And each god and goddess and nymph and demigod, they all have their various favorites. And when the clamor of the group becomes overwhelming in one direction or another, then seemingly Zeus swings the tide of battle. There's a pretty large clamor happening for human decency right now, which is not to say there aren't a lot of other viable narratives when we're looking at the Gaza situation. But there's a clamor for some human decency in the middle of all of this. And it's falling on deaf ears. There's no leadership in this situation. There's
no force with power that's willing to respond.
Yeah. And so one could certainly say that a lot of unjust things are happening right now. There's certainly perspectives that I think would be valid that would make that claim. There are a lot of folks that would say for instance, another goddess that I use a lot is Iris, who's a goddess of orphans. That would certainly be an essence that would be absolutely aghast at what's going on right now. Orphans are being made left, right, and center. These sometimes happen during warfare, but at least during, say, ancient Greek ages, the Spartans in some cases would, for instance, spend only fathers that had already had children off to war.
Mm-hmm.
And so this was something that was considered beforehand. And there weren't a lot of slaughters of civilian populations. There was sacking and, other things of cities. But generally speaking, the wars, certainly within Rome, the army for the longest time wasn't even allowed in the city. Warfare happened somewhere else. It didn't happen within the city. So they were cleaner divisions. This was when essences were... At least there was some attention on, how essences ought to be aligned. None of these are absolutes. These are just examples that come to mind in response to your questions. But, this is, at least for me as well, to just go back and ground back near the center.
Well, I think a lot of people feel powerless looking out at the events that are happening in the world. And but part of this is a consequence as well as we focus on news on a global scene, but as individuals, most of us don't have the power to act on the global scene, right? Mm-hmm. We've got more of a locality of our sphere of influence. So I think one of the things that happens is when this feeling of powerlessness enters, people might look at the stage of morality and of deciding, what is my personal morality as maybe inconsequential, right? So can you speak to that? Why does it matter that an individual comes into this conversation in their own life?
Yeah, I think that the question becomes, what does my world around me look like, and how can I align myself with others? I guess I would, the person whose work around this that is coming up for me is Charles Eisenstein's work. He speaks about there being an absence of a story present in life right now, that for those who are unfamiliar with his work, he refers to, the way that the United States used to be, for a lot of its past, or certainly most of the 20th century, is a society that lived within a story that said, go along, find your place in the world, make money, raise kids, trust technology, everything is getting better. And most people are coming into a belief earlier and earlier in their lives, and concluding that that's not true, and that that's not true for most people anymore. Many people are living in the United States without health insurance, and so a lot of people are having the experience of medical bankruptcies. A lot of folks are finding that the world is not created with fairness in mind, that someone might come up with an invention idea and it might be stolen from them. Someone may come up with an idea and start their business, and then somebody reverse engineers their product and then drives them out of the marketplace and undermines their company and their livelihood. That there's so much incentive now to just reap the rewards,
to play the game dishonestly.
Yeah. To simply pile up the biggest pile and not care about how one achieved that pile. That this has left so many in the wake of these, Scrooge McDucks that are sitting on their big pile of gold. That the vast majority of the world, much is made of the percentages, the 99% or whatever, are sitting here going, wait, what? Why is my life basically feeding, this small parasitic class that's stolen everything? That this is where a lot of people have arrived these days. And so a lot of people are trying to figure out what's the next story, right? What's the new story? Where can we all actually interact with one another? And so for me, at least, the importance of aligning is finding others that have shared purpose, shared values, that are wanting to work together and that value working together, that value being together with others who feel similarly, think similarly, feel about the world in similar ways. That finding those sorts of commonalities and shared interests is increasingly important for a number of reasons. One, that we can actually trust one another again. We're living in a world where trust is in incredibly short supply. We're also living in a world where I heard that professor I keep referring to, Vervanke, cite a number that over 80% of the population of the UK a few years ago identified as being lonely, as being fundamentally lonely in their lives, which led the government of the UK to create an Orwellian-sounding Ministry of Loneliness, which sounds frighteningly terrible.
Yeah, like what's the government going to do about this problem?
Do we want the government fixing this problem?
Yeah.
So
we'll be your friend.
Yeah. We'll give you chatbots on Snapchat. At any rate, these questions are endemic. I mean, the loneliness, meaninglessness, these are all very serious things. And, many people use terms like mental health, or behavioral health failings or crises. Some other thinkers are calling the state of the world a meta-crisis that just keeps spawning more symptoms. So at any rate, what do we do in the face of all of that? What do we do in the face of that, which feels overwhelming at times? It may not feel pervasively overwhelming every minute of our lives, but sometimes it creeps in. And one of the ways of combating that is having a group that we're connected with, that we're aligned with, that shares a common reality, that shares a common belief system or outlook system that can help to, Eisenstein calls it holding a reality together. And I think there's something in there that's important. There's a way in which, for me, I can see an outcome of writing books, and I certainly, I'd be honored and thrilled and ever grateful if the books that I write, when I'm, fully ready to put them out there and publish them, has an effect of helping people hold a reality. I feel like one of the things as a storyteller, especially as an educated storyteller that's read as much from the past as I have, is I want to try and bring forward realities that had meaning and importance to me and offer them a new home within a new setting to maybe offer the same type of solace to people today.
How do you feel about talking about receiving that work and just that process that's happening for you?
Yeah. How writing process works for me, or has started working for me, and I suppose maybe it's always evolving for writers. It's always a process that's alive and potentially subject to change. I happen to have a little bit of an unusual experience where I had had horrible sleep apnea most of my life, and then found a solution for that allowed me to actually have adequate oxygen for my brain. And so all of a sudden, I gained the ability to focus a great deal more and stay on task and stay on projects more than I had when I was younger. And this story, which has become the book series now, had been something that I had written, an opening chapter of, probably, 12 or 13 years beforehand, and then had written bits and baubles of, and had studied, the classics more and more, and mythology more and more, and some physics. And so eventually I sat down one day and started sitting down more and more, and found that I could enter into the interior of a character and hear the thoughts of and hear the feelings of a character. And then once I had connected with a couple of characters this way, 3 so far, through 4 books, although I'm not sure if a 4th character will emerge at some point, but being able to be inside of those characters, my writing process looks like I start to feel or hear the thought of the character and what they want to say. And so I start with dialogue, which is different than most other writers that I've heard of. Most of them have gone through writing programs, or it's just flung out of them at a young age, and they have their own method. But the method that works for me is to start with dialogue. And so I start there on the interior and then come outward from there. And so this informs why I write predominantly in first person present, and informs how very often I'm surprised by what happens. I can have a rough idea of what I think might happen, but quite often a character will completely change things around and something new will happen, or some new bit of knowledge comes out of a scene that I had no experience of.
So you're putting yourself into the context of that character and then allowing your interactions with the scene to come forth.
Yeah.
So it's a purely imaginative act.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the things that I've done is, put the word imagination in the center of a table, in the center of an empty room, except for the table, and walked around the table in the full 360 degrees and looked at the word imagination from many angles. Because, I have the full experience of imagination at this point, as we were talking about earlier in the conversation about having a logos of something, having a full, deep, penetrative understanding of something. And, the word imagination is interesting to me. It harkens back for me to, Einstein uses the word, and that conjures a certain way of thinking. I also wonder when all of this information sometimes will flood in that I didn't have before I'll write a scene. For instance, I'll have a grandmother talk to me about her love of her granddaughter. Well, I don't have any of that experience. I'm not a grandmother. I don't have any grandchildren. I don't know where exactly that comes from. Just as one example. Sometimes, the Titan Prometheus, gives a long speech at one point in the second book, and a lot of that just flowed through, lots of different bits and pieces that came from my interacting with that character, or just simply bringing myself to a state of openness, and then something came through. And certainly we use the word imagination to describe that process. Some people tell me that I'm channeling something. I don't really know exactly what channeling means. I've heard the term before, but I wouldn't necessarily have identified with that word first. But, if you are willing to go into a state of openness, then just be willing to see what happens. So I don't close myself off to any of those realities, but I'm also not trying to claim one and adhere to it either.
I think, maybe we want to accord mystical significance to something that is, as McGilchrist would say, it's the left brain and the right brain. And what is the right brain, the analytical side?
No, left.
Left? Okay.
Yeah, left is the servant or emissary.
Yeah.
The right's the master.
It's just that we've parked ourselves so firmly in the left that any manifestation of the right seems mystical to us.
Yeah.
Because it's not emphasized in our culture, and maybe that's an aspect of what's resurfacing as well.
Yeah. I think that's accurate, and what came up for me while you were saying that is there's a great conversation that McGilchrist and Rupert Sheldrake have on one of their podcasts together. I think they have a few, but the one I'm thinking of in particular, Rupert Sheldrake mentions that, I've forgotten which is which. In the morning he meditates, and in the evening he prays, or vice versa. And he actually sees both as distinct activities. I, in the past, have blended the two in my own thinking, or conflated the two in my own thinking. But he sees a very specific difference in those two actions. He describes one as an inhaling spiritually, and one as an exhaling spiritually. And that for him, they're that fundamental. And so I think that when we're talking about the creative process, I think that is what we're talking about doing, is allowing the left brain to recede, or our obsession with the analytical in the left brain to relax, almost like we're walking around with a muscle tensed. And so to allow that muscle to untense for a while is to allow more of a state of openness to be present. And that's where, quite frequently I've had several people who've, and we'll get into what alpha and beta reader mean in just a second, but, alpha and beta readers who just say, "Did you write this?" And I'll say, "Yeah, I had the experience of sitting down and putting that in the file, but I honestly don't feel like I am claiming the knowledge. I don't claim the knowingness. Oftentimes what ends up on the page ends up teaching me something that I didn't know." And to me, that is a wonder of the experience of writing and storytelling, or really, I think, art of any kind, being in a flow state and then beholding what has happened while we were in the flow state afterwards and saying, "Wow, I didn't even know how to do that. And yet here it is. It just happened." That can be quite a mystical experience in its own way.
Yeah.
So that was I'd say the first subject matter that you mentioned, just talking about that process. There are some other pieces to it. I like to sit with my eyes closed in the morning before I actually get up and get moving around. I know that I'm awake, but I don't, I can hear my dogs moving around, or I can hear sounds or what have you. I know. And I often will sense an urge. I should check what time it is. The left brain is still there, but I just say, I'm going to stay right here, and sometimes I only manage it for 5 minutes, and then something gives me that strong itch to check my phone, and then I'm into what's going on in the world and all the other things, like the rabbit hole of that. But on what feel like some of my best days, I can stay with that state a little bit longer, especially if I've had some powerful dreams the night before. Then at least for me, I believe that there's a feeling that a Taoist teacher that I used to describe as she had this heart-based meditation, and she always said that when you come back from it, most of her students would say that there's a certain sweetness present in their life when they've spent time in their heart for a while. That I think when we're in the dream space and we hold on to that energy for a little while and we let that dream be present, or if we have a creative project and our creative project and the energies of the dream mix together in some way, that something very powerful and interesting happens. And again, if, to use the lens of McGilchrist, then I would say, you're talking about the right hemisphere is just allowing so many factors to come in that normally the left doesn't like dealing with 1,000 variables. It doesn't work for the left. The left needs very few, very understood, very concrete. The right revels in being open to the wonder and the multiplicity of connection.
Yeah, in the Taoist sense, this is very close to the sense of yin and yang. Mm-hmm. Yin being the allowing, cultivating energy that's providing space for something to grow, but doesn't tell it what it should be. And yang is this objective, strategic, I have an outcome that I want, and I'm aligning all possible energies towards that outcome.
Yep.
And the Chinese, the Taoists at least, set that aside apart from, male or female. They actually accorded its own, this is yin and yang. These are two different energies, and one's also kind of a attracting, drawing in energy, and the other is an outward radiating energy. So these can be associated with masculine and feminine, but they are not necessarily. And men and women both have these qualities, and our lives are an interplay of recognizing when one quality is taking priority in the way that we're relating to the world.
Yeah, that seems right. Let's see, there was one other thing you wanted me to touch upon, which is the editing and revising process. Is that right?
Yeah, your editing process, and also, just what are you learning about this process of publishing a book? What is this teaching you?
Yeah, well, one of the things that it's been teaching me, I think, is like with any attempt to self-study something with a practical outcome, with a physical outcome, with an eventual objective outcome, there are certain things that I think are good advice in terms of try and follow this process. For instance, I've learned, what does the industry think about word counts? I didn't know, when I first started out. What does the industry think about the editing process? How many types of editing are there? Well, it turns out there are 4. Most people who are not in the industry don't know that. I didn't know that at the start. There's developmental editing, which is, your story arc and sort of your big picture questions. And then there's line editing, which was more about your kind of paragraph and sentence flow. And then there's copy editing and proofreading. And those essentially get down to, should that be a comma or a period? Is all your punctuation correct? Is your grammar correct? You really get down into the very, minutia of the piece. You don't want to start at the bottom and come up, because you may axe entire characters. You may axe entire chapters. You may axe, parts of a plot line, and you've cut out 5 chapters. Well, if you've proofread all of those chapters, obviously, then you've wasted a lot of energy. So there's a certain methodology to publishing, which is tried and true, which is what you do. However, I would say that the conventional wisdom right now is never go beyond 80,000. Well, if I had stopped at 80,000 for my first book, half my book would be missing. I ended up splitting a very long book up and finding a spot to try and get it closer to 80,000, and now I've written even more in the first book. And so So I don't know that all wisdom is created equally, and I guess that's the part of the process for me is what's going to work for me among the conventional pieces of wisdom and what's not. And I think that that's a journey that each author has to take. Then there are choices. Do you want to self-publish? That offers certain benefits and certain penalties. Do you want to try and chase after a publishing house directly? Again, certain pluses, certain minuses. Do you want to chase after an agent? Certain pluses, certain minuses. If you're not going any of those routes, if you do want to go the self-publishing route, how do you find an editor? How do you find a publicist? How do you find any of the roles that a publishing house would normally give to you? Lots of questions around those things. And how do you find the answers to those things? Well, there are a bunch of groups. There are a bunch of people creating YouTube content for this. I haven't looked specifically, but I bet there are a bunch of those folks that have got Patreon accounts set up where if you're a writer, you can look at their advice. Brandon Sanderson puts a lot out that seems to be of a pretty high quality. There are a number of others that seem to have a pretty good way of communicating what they believe to be true about writing. So my own experience, though, let me recenter in on that, is I found value in beta reading, alpha reading. I suppose that would be something like crowdsourcing. So I'm interested in hearing the experience of reading my work from others. Mm-hmm. And what that helps me to know is what's there and what's not there in my book. I experience something that I call eye blindness when I'm too close to the work and I'm really working on it very intensely. This is a phenomenon that a lot of authors have. You stop reading the words that are actually there on the page because you've already got a version of it in your head. There are ways to try and combat that. You can read backwards. You can start at the end of a chapter and read the last paragraph and then read the second to last paragraph and the third and so on to try and break that. There are tricks. You can read it aloud. These are all tricks to how can you do a lot of the work yourself rather than hiring other people, because it's not inexpensive. For a book of my size, 170,000 words or so, you're talking about a $10,000 to $15,000 editing bill. So not insubstantial. And that's just to have one editor pass over it. That's not to have your design. That's not to have your cover designed. That's not to have any marketing company help you, any publicists, anyone help you do any outreach of any kind, shoot any videos on Book Talk or any of the other Instagram Reels or any of the other venues that get your name out there. So that's the big picture stuff. I want to just mention briefly, the other part is learning how to accept feedback and learning how to ask for feedback. That doesn't necessarily come naturally. That's another process, at least it has been for me. It's knowing where a reader might be coming from. How do they like to read? How do they like a story told to them? That is a question that's on the table in any type of a relationship with.
Do you see patterns happening in the way people read?
Yeah, I do. I don't think they're as clear-cut as some people make them out to be. I think that some people would like to say that women read in one way, men read in one way. Certainly there are truths to that, and there are a lot of outliers. I think that's the case with a lot of folks. If someone's really educated, they might read in a different way. I have a very well-educated uncle, who reads in a certain way. And, my family, I think, has a quality of, especially where I've read all the classics, and many of the classics are very dense. And so I had the experience many times of feeling a certain type of a discomfort while I was reading. And I could identify that as, gosh, this is boring. Gosh, this is not written well. Gosh, this is overly dense. This could be expressed in a much simpler way. But there's then the voice that would answer in my head is, I have an assignment. I need to read this. So get reading. It doesn't matter what your immediate reactions are. It doesn't matter what your initial visceral responses are. You've got to finish this by Tuesday. So you can either, look at how much the entire, assignment is, break it up, read this much now. So when I come to read things, I have that to draw upon. I know that a lot of readers don't have that, and most readers are reading for pleasure. Mm-hmm. So if they encounter anything like even a soft barrier, even a moment of discomfort, that's it. That book is done. I'm finished with it. And so I think some authors, follow the formulas because they want to capture as many readers as possible. I don't really ever have a desire to reach every single reader. Already in doing, so I mentioned alpha and beta readers earlier. I just want to mention the type of readers there are. So an alpha reader is basically someone who's reading for you while you're working. You haven't even really finished a full draft yet, or you finished an incredibly rough draft. It's not even really ready for reading yet. A beta reader is somebody who's reading a draft that in theory is a complete draft. And then from there you can have ARC readers, which are they'd get an advanced copy of your book, but your book is basically in publishable form already. An editor can generally come somewhere in between there, or you can have a developmental editor before you have a beta reader, or a beta before you have a developmental editor. Anyway, that hopefully clarifies the landscape for people who don't know those terms a little bit. Yeah, I would say, and they're also something that I use are mutual critique partnerships. So in other words, I will read someone else's book for them and provide them feedback. They will read my book for me and provide me feedback. So to this point, I've read a few genres that I don't normally read to get some different feedback that I don't normally get.
Right.
And I've read a couple of young adult novels, which are normally not my thing.
Exchange with another author.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I don't generally care for young adult fiction. It's not normally my favorite type. I tend to find that the tropes are very similar, especially post-Twilight. There's a lot of vampires. There's a lot of werewolves. There's a lot of love triangles. There's a lot of what, at least for me, I call in my own head, watered-down Romeo and Juliet. There was something raw and potent about the actual Romeo and Juliet. It was vital and incredibly powerful. And yet, when it's mimicked in young adult fiction by a lot of authors, it feels very pale and stale and just not fun. But I've read a couple of those types of things because I'm interested in hearing a broad swath of responses to my writing. Because as long as I have each response in perspective, in other words, I'm not going to respond to every single person's opinion and change the book to suit what they tell me it should be saying. Because otherwise I had someone recently who apparently likes a lot of erotica, and they wanted me to write my characters as though they were thinking about sex nonstop. I mean, that may be great for certain types of fiction. I have a couple of friends actually, or acquaintances of sorts from high school. One who writes erotica, professionally, and that's what she writes, and I think that's fine. But it's not what I want my story to be, nor do I want my story to be a young adult fiction. So at any rate, I think there's value in listening to different perspectives, because any perspective could offer you, a really penetrating insight that allows you to get something that either is or isn't there in your book, that once you hear it and once you reflect upon it, you kind of say, okay, yeah, now I see a little piece that I do feel like was either absent or maybe was blocking some people's entrance into the book. For those who are listening, Brandon has read for me, and he offered me a piece of advice early on, which was that he described reading as a flow state, and that part of what the job of an author is to not block the reader's flow state. And I think that's a great, very sort of generalized, observation is if I'm writing in such a way, even if it's clear to me, but it's blocking something for the reader, that, it's almost like, coming upon the field, right? And I'm telling you, I've made the field ready for you, but it's got a whole bunch of stones in it. Well, I've got to get off my ass and get some of those stones out of that field. Otherwise, it's not a field. So. Yeah,
and early on, one of the things we were talking about is just the breadcrumbs of, proper context. Like a character walks into a room. Like as a reader, I need a little bit of information to orient myself to know what's going on as we transition to one scene to the next. And I definitely witnessed, reading book 2 and 3. It's like when you were writing those books, you were spot on to begin with. So I really felt like you'd incorporated a lot of feedback that you'd gotten on the first book, and it had now become a part of your writing process.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's also a recursive quality to it as well, because I'll learn things myself as I'm writing. One of the reasons why I haven't published a thing yet is I'm still discovering and learning things, in the 4th book, even still, that's coming back and informing little tiny adjustments in the first book. They're getting to be less and less the further into the series I go. Someone mentioned to me, does it ever end? And, maybe on some level it doesn't. But I think at a certain point, the nature, the quantity, or the power of the ripples, if you will, become less and less. So when I was writing the second book, I would say there were probably some things that were powerfully interruptive of the first book. And if I hadn't gone back and clarified, it would have made the first book feel lacking by, but
and not tying in fully
yes,
to the second.
Yes. But now as I'm working on the 4th, the only things that come up are really fairly minor things. That, a slight, smoothing of a phrase, or a tiny, reference to something could be just that extra tiny little kernel or breadcrumb that could really make an opening up of something appear much more natural. So the further I get into the series, the less dramatic of an effect the changes need to be earlier on. So that's how, at least for myself, I know that I'm getting very close to the point where book 1 is now ready to be finished, and book 1 is now ready to be put out there in the world.
Mm-hmm.
There's one thing that it's come up for me a couple of times as we've been talking. I want to just mention, a unique, at least it feels unique to me. I haven't heard a lot of authors talk about it yet. I've been thinking with the first book of, on the one hand, not taking it all the way to Marvel Comics so that it's accessible to everybody, but making it more accessible to a broader audience than perhaps it was when I first wrote it. And that may include, taking a little bit of intimacy out in a couple of places that might be a little bit strong and I really don't feel like is crucial to the story, things like this. But I think there are so many interesting supportive platforms right now where I don't think it's necessary to fully compromise, especially if you're self-publishing. I think if you have a relationship with a publishing house, then it's more complicated because then they want exclusive rights and they want different things. But I can easily see a scenario like this, for instance, that I really hone and craft my first novel to a point where it can really be enjoyed and appreciated by a broad swath of people. And I can also have an author's copy on, say, Substack, where if somebody enjoyed the first version, they could actually go and read a much more in-depth, something like a director's cut by analogy from the movies.
Yep.
And it would be relatively easy for a self-published author to have that in place. So they can tell their story the way they want to, and they can also write a story that they know will be adhering to a little bit more of the formula, enough of the formula.
Here's the PG rated, and here's the original version. Yeah.
Something like that. So I'm also negotiating that possibility in my mind of, the changes that I want to make to book one to bring it to a published state, which, by the way, doesn't mean, dumbing it down all the way, although that's something that I get, some criticism around. Someone said something like, I don't want to have to digest another intellectual bowling ball, of another chapter, which was a bit overly dense, and I needed to clean up a bit. And I get that from a certain perspective that could be, a response. But I move in the direction of, okay, well, I think I need to have a glossary. That tells me that I need to have a glossary because I've got Greek terms, I've got Greek words, I've got a lot of character names. This is going to be a very epic series, of, 10 to 15 books or something, very substantial. And looking at the other authors that have followed that route, I mean, Robert Jordan, as an example, has an extensive glossary in the back of every single one of his books.
I mean, because it's rooted in Greek mythology, I mean, I think it would be lovely to have a couple of appendixes where you're referring to the Greek mythology to actually summarize that and say, hey, here's what happened in the Iliad as backstory.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the final, I know we definitely should be wrapping up here very shortly, but there have been a few other people who have used a somewhat similar model to what I'm playing around with. So there's an author, I think her name's Madeline Miller, who wrote a book recently called Circe, about one of the sorceresses who seduced Odysseus on his journey. And I started reading it recently, and it's interesting, but it's a different kind of story. It's literary fiction, meaning it's really going for, that's this sort of vague space between poetry and prose, and really playing on beautiful language and, succinct sentences and sentence structures which are alternatingly long and short, and has just a real feeling to it. I think of literary fiction as having a unique feeling to it. And I enjoy reading literary fiction sometimes. It's not my go-to, but I do enjoy it from time to time. But it's definitely not what I have in mind for Particles. And, and the Percy Jackson novels, certainly, many people have even know about Greek mythology because of the Percy Jackson novels. So all credit to the author, whose name eludes me at the moment. I never read the books, and I think I only saw the first movie one time. And I generally, for myself, for my own style of enjoyment of stories, didn't enjoy it. But that's not to reflect on, I think it opened up access to something that I'm glad that it opened up access to, because to be honest, the age range of when those book stories came out probably means that I have a readership out there that I don't even know, because they encountered the Greek myths through Percy Jackson, and now that they're mature adults, they might actually be open to a story that I would put out there. So I think that that's also interesting, that there is you asked the question earlier about a resurfacing, or about bringing things forward, bringing up good moral examples, bringing back wisdom from the past. And so I think that there's an urge in the species to do that. I think there's a part of us, some of us that are in the sort of artists group, or that play around with this, whatever you want to call it, right hemispheric or imagination or whatever.
Well, and if you've been asking the question, well, what is going on? Things don't seem to match up.
Yeah.
Things don't seem to be working out. You know, if you're a person who's been picking at the edges and trying to come to your own answers, then I think, it's another source of information, right?
Yeah.
To integrate the old wisdoms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think of it as the example that just came up to me is like, say you have an image, a sort of very famous image, like say something like throwing a trident, right? Which comes very strongly from Greek mythology, very strongly around the god Poseidon. And, I think that that's something that you see that image with Percy Jackson, where, spoiler alert, Percy's the son of Poseidon in the story, one of Poseidon's sons.
Well, kids are playing Minecraft now, and
throwing tridents, are they?
There's these zombies that throw tridents.
Okay, I've never played Minecraft. So.
And, do they know, what that's rooted in?
Yeah, what the history of that is, what the context is. Yeah. So, I think that those things, are important and they have their place. And certainly, I already have my own version, although it hasn't appeared yet. But I've thought about Zeus's lightning bolts, and how does that work? And at least in my story, I know how it's going to work, even though I'm a long way from us actually ever seeing them. I do know how they'll work. And I think that the desire to resurface things is such a wonderful thing. I think the desire to bring forward moral lessons and frameworks is a powerful, potent thing, because I think they have these qualities, that my college asks that question about why is something a great book, because it has a universal quality, because it doesn't have a timely quality, or rather, it has a quality which is always timely, which is potentially timely now, and then 30 years from now, it may be timely again. And so that's what I feel like I've connected with and contacted within the energies that motivate me to write my story.
Mm. So your book series is called Particles?
Series is called Particles, pen name undecided so far, for a variety of reasons. First book called Dark Tempests, the Dark Tempests. I'm not certain after that, because what I have right now as a second book would be Prometheus' Great Secret, and I'm not sure if the Dark Tempests ends up being split into two smaller books. That's undecided. That's, again, part of that revising, editing, learning process, publishing process that is somewhat complicated and that I'm still navigating. But.
Okay. And I don't think there's any places where people can go yet to get in the loop on this. But I'd love to do another episode with you as we get further along and have more announcements. And at some point, I'm sure you'll have a mailing list and a website set up for it, and
and an Instagram page, and every ad nauseum, every platform that you have to have something on to corral the traffic and interest.
Well, right on. So thanks so much for showing up and taking the time. And, again, as I said to you personally as well, I wanted to kind of give people an introduction to you, because we'll be having more conversations. Who knows what we'll be talking about, the news of the day, or some philosophical topics that interest us. So,
well, thanks for having me, Brandon. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. And best